Hello and welcome to another episode of Business and Bubble Tea. It is my pleasure to be introducing Rohit Chikballapur, the co-founder of Matchik. Rohit, it's fantastic to have you on Business and Bubble Tea with us today.
Thanks, William. It's good to be here.
Welcome, Rohit. On your LinkedIn profile, we saw that you define yourself as the 0 to 1 entrepreneur. I guess this refers to the famous book 0 to 1. Did you read the book and then got the inspiration for your company, Matchik, or how did your entrepreneurial journey start?
Well, 0 to 1 is a fantastic book. I can't deny that it had a lot of influence on me as I just got started. In fact, I was wrestling with the idea of whether to start or not, and I came across that book. In fact, a friend recommended it to me, and reading that kind of definitely opened a side of my risk-taking side, I would say, to it. But I think the most important part that resonated with me from the book was the fact that you need to know something that nobody else knows or nobody else believes to be correct, and you're basically building off of that. And that, I think, is something that we did at Matchik as well. And so in that sense, yes, definitely an influence.
And leading on from that, can you tell us about Matchik? What is the problem you're solving at Matchik?
Sure. So Matchik, when we started Matchik, we were trying to build a two-sided platform. On one side, you have industrial machinery companies that sell equipment to factories mostly. And then on the other side, you have factories, of course, that are operating those machines. And if you look at that equation, right, so a lot of excess energy consumption, safety issues in a factory, sustainability on the whole, and I'll come to that in a bit as well. But all of these, I would say, problems or these key things to work on depends on how well that interaction between the machine supplier and the factory works. And when I started building Matchik with my co-founder, we realized that there was no platform that kind of made it easy for these two parties to collaborate. And especially true for a factory is the fact that, if you go into a factory, unlike your house where you probably have one brand that you kind of like and you buy a lot of your white goods from, in a factory, you're fundamentally 200 different equipment suppliers. And it makes it impossible to kind of work with each of them in an efficient manner. And that's kind of what we started building in the beginning. Of course, we've pivoted away from that into a more specific problem that we're solving today, primarily around how to efficiently manage your equipment as a factory in order to kind of make sure that it's energy efficient, it is safe, and you don't have downtime when you're trying to kind of produce your products. You don't have your machines going down and then all of the additional costs that you incur from that. But that's kind of what we do today.
So what I get from that is it's kind of like a good management system for dealing with all third parties involved in the manufacturing process. Is that fair to say?
Yes, primarily as it relates to the equipment suppliers, but yes, it does.
And we noticed that, so you also do business, you're an international company, and part of your business you do is in Asia. Can you tell us a little bit more about working in that market?
Asia for us is one of the most exciting markets. It's an area that we started focusing on sometime in the beginning of last year. We think of it as pretty much where most of our future growth is going to come from, apart from North America as well. And this is primarily because, if you just look at South and Southeast Asia, just leaving aside China for just a minute, because China is huge and it probably deserves its own focus, right? But if you look at South and Southeast
complex Asia, in so many ways.
Absolutely, and I've lived there, and I think that's something that's very close to my heart. But if you just look at this Asia outside of China, right? Even that is roughly about half the world's population, roughly speaking. And it's a population that is young. It's a population that has been historically underserved in many ways. And it's also a set of countries and economies that are on rapid growth right now. And it's, I think, one of the areas where we kind of made a conscious decision that we want to look at. And the way we've been growing there is primarily through partners. And we've been lucky enough to have a few that are very convinced about us, and they tend to be our best advocates, I would say, in the market.
And considering,
and I guess, like, what was your Sorry, Roberta?
I was going back to China because we left it out. So what's the difference with China, and do you see it in the future of Magic?
In the future, definitely hope so. But I think the nuance of China is like William was saying, it's a complex market, it's a complex country, and it requires a certain amount of scale to begin with if you want to kind of succeed in China as a foreign company. It's another thing that you are born in China and you grow in China, and then you're kind of very well connected with how China works. But if you're not a Chinese company, and if you are kind of coming from even outside the region, I think it is better to wait till you're big enough in order to kind of really give the market the attention that it is due and the resources that it requires as well. That's the difference, I would say. Maybe if I were to add one additional thing. Yeah, sorry, William.
If I were to add go ahead, Rohit.
No, just one additional thing. I think China is also a country that has a lot of capital that's flowing into startups. So I suspect any problem that China deserves to solve, or rather that China believes is worth solving, you have half a dozen Chinese startups that are working on solving right now. So in that sense, I think it is sufficiently well served compared to other parts of the world.
And I've also, I guess, one founder we interviewed even mentioned that once you solve a problem in China, it's such a big market in of itself that it's almost like you just do it in China, and then it's kind of a big enough pie for you to sort of be happy with doing business there I guess, if you start domestically.
Absolutely. And I think, there are certain nuances of China. They're no longer nuances. There are actually such big differences between the Chinese market, the way the Chinese market approaches things, and the others, that what is built for China finds it, with the exception of TikTok, of course, which has done a fantastic job, and a few others. But with that exception, I would say, and even in the case of TikTok, I think what solves China's needs don't necessarily solve the needs of other markets in the same way, and vice versa is true as well. So I think from that perspective, I think by the time an idea succeeds, enough people have seen it and they've kind of built a local equivalent of what China is doing, and the opposite as well. So from that perspective, I think, it's a market that is more insular for that reason, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you could definitely say that for things like OpenAI, where you see kind of ChatGPT-3s being used for Bing and Microsoft, and now we've seen that Baidu search, a sort of Chinese search engine, is using its own ChatGPT-3 now. So you kind of, I guess, you see the technology being introduced in that way. Just turning more back towards, I guess, you mentioned sort of Southeast Asia and this sort of huge segment of growth and opportunity. What was it like, I guess, initially making those first steps and inroads with those partners out there? Now that you've kind of, I guess, mentioned that it's sort of a big opportunity for Magic.
Well, I think in that sense, it worked like pretty much everywhere. You start with acquaintances that you have. And one of the best things about China is when I was living there, and this was between 2004 and 2009, so 6 years. I met a lot of people who then went on to other parts of the world and who are really successful based on everything I think we did together, and we learned in the phase that China was at that time, right? So a lot of those acquaintances came in handy. We reconnected, we spoke of what we're doing. Some of them were able to help us. Some of them were also quite active in adjacent fields to us. We have today somebody who's like a retired, how do I say, head of sales from a Japanese metal works company in Southeast Asia, who's kind of helping us expand there and so on. But I think what excites me the most about it is there are massive needs. They are, I would say, a little earlier in the cycle than Europe and the West is, but that enables them to adopt technology that the West simply will not, because I think the return on investments aren't quite the same, right? So the massive leap that Southeast Asia is going to make, especially in the kind of technology that we are working in, will probably put that entire region quite far ahead in the decade to come.
And on the other hand, which difficulties have you encountered while pursuing this expansion in Southeast Asia? What has been the most difficult part in this?
I think it's speed to some extent, because if you look at Southeast Asia, you talk of it as one region, but culturally it's so different, say between Thailand and Indonesia, between Vietnam and Cambodia and so on, right? So we have to kind of make our bets. So from that perspective, I think we are today looking at Indonesia, we're looking at Malaysia, we're of course looking at Singapore. So first, I think the big challenge is to make sure that one of the things about a startup is you don't have a lot of time, and you need feedback quickly. So we tend to kind of prioritize the countries where the culture kind of aligns with that. I particularly like Indonesia and Singapore for that. Yeah. Vietnam as well.
And what particularly strikes you about lovely, and what particularly strikes you about Indonesia as like a market that you want to go for, within the context of Southeast Asia, given it's such a sort of, as you say, diverse space? What sort of, coming as a kind of outsider, like what struck it about you, and how is it, what challenges have existed in getting out there?
Well, I think Indonesia is a massive country that nobody seems to recognize from outside, right? I mean, it's close to 300 million people. I think it's like the fourth largest country in the world from a population perspective, if I remember correctly, fourth or the fifth, but definitely in the top 10. And
the next largest after India and China, I think, in terms of GDP potential, sort of growth, this sort of stuff.
Absolutely. And I think that's critical. And I think one of the things that happens to large population countries that are growing at that speed, right, is that there is a willingness to try things, provided that, they obviously do the due diligence, but they're willing to give new technologies and new ideas a try, a go. And they are also kind of have this culture of, okay, we have to do this frugally, we have to manage our risk. We have to give these, if something looks promising, let's give it a try. And if it works, we adopt it. And that's, I think, very different from, especially Europe, where, you tend to be much more risk averse because things are working. You say, why change things that aren't broken? And so
very conservative, I'd say.
Very conservative. Yeah, very conservative. And I think it's not wrong on their part to think that way. It's just that I think the return on investment for new technologies in a mature economy is perhaps lower compared to a growing one. So that's, I think, the thing that I like most about Indonesia and India for that matter as well. But very different countries, but very similar in other ways.
And what about India?
And how would you go for it, Roberta?
No, just to know more about the Indian market as well, like the difficulties or the pro and cons about that, and about your experience in India.
No, well, see, in both countries, right, and this is probably true for India, because we've already seen that. But it's very difficult to do business in. I think it's probably going to be the case in Indonesia as well, without a local presence, where you're kind of working as a technology provider from outside of the region, without having too much of I would say, a local footprint in terms of a sales force and so on. It takes a lot longer, or rather, it's much harder to convince people that you're actually serious about the country. So that's definitely one of those things. And we're going to address that in the coming months, of course. Yeah, absolutely. They're like, are you committed to our region, or is this just like a one-off customer that you want to get? And in that case, will we have the same level of support going forward? Is this a relationship that we want to invest in, and so on? So those are good questions to have, right, as a customer. So that's one.
And how do you okay, yeah, and the next one?
And the next one is actually just capital flows. I mean, it's the amount of tax regulation that you have if you invoice a customer. As a Swiss company, if you want to invoice an Indian customer, there are so many things that you need to know, right? So it's not as simple as transacting within the EU or with the US and so on. So there are things that you have to be conscious about, or be aware, I would say, with regards to foreign exchange and so on. And those are things that are, again, easier to do as a bigger company, but this is something we've somehow managed to get around because we've had that experience in the past.
And turning back to sort of the first barrier hurdle you mentioned, I'm just interested to know sort of how did you establish that relationship, that guanxi, if you like, that we kind of term things in China. Is it boots on the ground? Is it how do you build that relationship with that local partner and almost demonstrate to them that you're serious and you're kind of there to stay?
Well, I think we got lucky in the sense that I had local contacts who have, of course, a pretty good footprint on the ground, right? So these were people that I had met decades ago, and we've stayed in touch for a very long time. And you're right, it is in the end guanxi, meaning that there is a personal liability factor from a relationship perspective to say, hey, I'm not going to leave you in the lurch if you get me customers who are kind of trusting you to kind of make sure it works. If it doesn't work, we're not going to leave you in the dry. So that's something that happens at a personal level between people, I would say. So in this case, it is me and some of the partners that we're working with. And to be fair, that's also still where we are. So we haven't really scaled up the partnerships to large companies that we don't know personally. So it's still working from a very personal perspective, but it's been remarkably successful. And usually those partners introduce us to other companies that are interested in partnering in other fields, and they have come back and so on. So that's, I think it's a very gradual process. The only way you can kind of accelerate that is if you're kind of raising a lot of capital, investing in building a sales office and local faces, right? If you're not going to do that, it's going to take time, but it's probably a lot more healthy, a much more healthy way to kind of grow the business as well, especially in these times.
And what do you think's been, I guess, the key to establishing that guanxi, sort of those, you mentioned sort of several year long relationships with people that can do business out in Indonesia. What do you think's been one kind of key to that success, that formula to your success out in Indonesia? As a business trying to really use your network out there.
I think that formula is the same no matter where you go in the world. It's in the end walking the talk. If you demonstrate that you are always going to do that, eventually people kind of start to trust you.
Okay, that's really interesting. And I'm just wondering, because you have a really you come from a background in engineering and computer science. How was the passage to running a business and founding your own company? Did you encounter any difficulty, or was it smooth?
Oh, I think I could write a book, but good books have already been written, so I won't do that. But absolutely,
0 to 1 being a
very good example of that, right? Absolutely. Look, what I will say is this: nothing prepares you to start a business except the act of doing it, and nothing prepares you for the problems that you will encounter, because in the end, every problem you will encounter has a personal nuance to it. No problem appears the same. It's not just a function of who you are, but it's also a function of time. So what's happening around you at a particular point of time, right? So so I think the most important thing is that this is not a journey that you do alone. It's always better to do it with a co-founder, and I'm sure I'm not the first person who's saying that, because in the end, it's a journey where you have very high ups and very low lows, and you would ideally want to average the highs and the lows with somebody else who's not the same person as you are, who has a different personality to some extent, who can kind of, temper both the highs and the lows. So that's the first thing I would say. And the second thing is, I think it's important to tell yourself constantly that this is a marathon. It's not a 100-meter race. The 100-meter races that you hear about where, a company goes from founding to $1 billion exit, like the Instagram story, those are just so rare that they're useful to kind of market to the smart people of the world that they should be building startups instead of working in another company. But it almost never really happens to everybody, right? So that's the thing. But most importantly, when you're talking about being in a marathon, not a 100-meter race, it's also important to kind of realize that you have to do this 100 meters at a time or a kilometer at a time. So you really have to kind of pace yourself in order to do that. And that's perhaps been the biggest lesson that I've learned in the time that I've been building Magic.
Well, Rohit, that's all we've got time for today. But thank you so much for joining us on Business and Bubble Tea. It's been an absolute pleasure.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Roy.